This is video history from the J. Bay Jacobs Library for the History of Obstetrics and Gynecology in America at the American College. And on this fine spring afternoon in 1990 in San Francisco, my guest is Dr. Ervin E. Nichols, longtime Director of Practice Activities for the college, known to an entire generation as Nick. Nick is how you get addressed today.
Good.
Pleased to have you here this afternoon, Nick.
Well, it's fun and a delight to be here and share with you.
What we really like to do on these interviews is not only to tell what you did, but something about yourself. So why don't you start at the beginning and tell me where you came from?
Well, I came from a little town up in northwest Washington called Port Angeles. It's almost on the Canadian border, across from Victoria. Lots of trees, a little bit of rain, and occasional sunshine. And I grew up there. Left when I was about 17 or 18 years old and have moved back there about 5 years ago.
How did you get into medicine, and where did your career take you as that began?
Well, that's, I've never told you this, but as I grew up, my mother died when I was only 11, but before she died, she had sort of instilled into me the idea that medicine might be something that I should do. My father was a businessman, and he was in building and construction and things like that, engineering. We built bridges, and I thought that maybe that's what I was going to do. But one day I said something to my dad about medicine, and he says, "That's it." And from then on, being a well-behaved young man, I followed his advice.
Now, I seem to recall, harking back to Port Angeles, a story about you selling fruit when you were growing up. And
you want that story?
Tell our audience about that.
Well, that was early in my entrepreneurial activities. And we lived very close to the center of town, and the town at that time was only about 8,000 people. And we had 2 big cherry trees in our backyard, Bing cherries. They were beautiful. And I'm not sure how I knew the territory I was going to solicit, but anyway, I made a deal with my mother. If I could pick cherries, would she let me go downtown and try to sell them? And she agreed that that would be okay. So I found this establishment downtown, and it had doors and a long stairway that went up with a red carpet. And you go up this carpet, and you ring a bell, and a little door opens, and an angel looks out the window of that little door. And she looks down, and she says, "And what would you like, my young man?" I said, "Would you like to buy some cherries?" So the upshot of that little encounter was that her establishment apparently had cherries for their customers, and she agreed to buy all of the cherries that I could provide in the little bags that I brought them down in.
I'm not sure what sort of a start that was to your career, but anyway. When you left Port Angeles, where did you go away to school?
Well, I went to Walla Walla College, and that's still in Walla Walla. In case you don't know, they have a very fine retirement home there for bad people, the state prison. But they also have a couple of colleges, and I went to Walla Walla, and then from there to Loma Linda University, where I spent a little while and finally came out a MD.
And at the end of that time, or shortly after that, as I recall, you got into the U.S. Air Force.
Yes. The war came along. Incidentally, I was in Seattle during the outbreak of the war, Pearl Harbor, and it was, having been a private flyer before the war, I went on and tried to go into the Air Force as a qualified pilot, but they heard or learned or became aware that I was a physician, and so I finally ended up there as a flight surgeon rather than a pilot.
Where were you stationed?
Well, I was stationed again at, interestingly enough, Walla Walla, which was my first duty station, and from there We floated around a little bit. I did a little bit at Carlisle Barracks, and it's colder than you know what at Carlisle in February. And I had a tour at Randolph Field, becoming qualified as a flight surgeon, and then Florida and overseas to Italy, where I spent a year with heavy bombers, B-17s to be exact. And that sort of ended the flying aspects of it, but that's where I was.
What then, after the war, happened to your career?
Well, I came back, and I got back to California, and it had been predetermined in my mind that I wanted to do obstetrics and gynecology. I went to the Los Angeles County and was able to procure a residency in obstetrics and gynecology, and I was there for about 4 years as a resident. Took some of us a little longer than others, but then stayed on as a teaching resident for a year or two, and then started practicing in Pasadena, California.
And you were a good long time in Pasadena, weren't you? How long a time was it?
About 22 years.
Did you practice by yourself,
No,
with partners?
We did what I think was unique at that time, that one of my fellow residents and myself started out as a team, and we got a new office, and we started practicing, and we had 2 doctors, 1 patient, and 1 nurse. And we practiced in that fashion. We took calls every other day. We never, in other words, we were always on an alternate call situation, and we grew from that particular status.
Everybody always asks an obstetrician how many babies they delivered. How many babies did you deliver?
More than 1,000.
Probably way more than
Yes.
1,000.
Well, you know, that question, particularly during your residency program and in your teaching program, did you deliver them or did you it's like the con on a ship. I mean, the yeomen and the sailors and so on really do the work, but you get the credit.
Now, of course, we don't remember you for all the years that you spent in practice, although I know a lot of your patients do because I keep running into them from time to time, but remember you for your academic efforts, which then led on to ACOG. Tell me about that.
Well, after practice for 5 or 6 years, during that time I was invited onto the staff of Loma Linda and as a teaching individual. And shortly after that, circumstances came along, and I ended up as chairman of the department. And found out, however, that the budget was very, very slim.
How slim was slim?
Well, I had a department, and as I recall, I had to run the whole department, which had several employed people and all of the things that went along with it, for about $30,000 a year.
Of course, these days, a departmental chairman who doesn't have $2 million in the budget thinks he can't work.
Well, the department ran entirely on voluntary people, both at the Los Angeles County Hospital and at the White Memorial Hospital where we were working. But I found that left a very little money for the chairman, and obviously he had to work to continue to buy food for the kids. And then he had partners who were disturbed that maybe he wasn't putting enough effort into the practice, and you know how that goes along.
And you were there how long as chairman?
Well, I was a retread. Actually, as it worked out, we recognized that it would not work to try to live off of the salary of a chairman who had a budget of $30,000. So I resigned as chairman, stayed on the attending staff, and went back to full-time practice. Then in 1967, when they took the school and amalgamated it into one campus, which was at Loma Linda, previously the clinical part had been in Los Angeles, I was again coerced to, I'm not sure that's right, but invited and succumbed to moving out there to Loma Linda as a geographic full-time chairman, had a little better budget then, and things were a little bit better.
And you went to join ACOG when?
In 1969, as I recall, it was about September or so that I was invited to come back for an interview to see if I might be interested to join the college. And this was sort of at the instigation of Keith Russell. They were looking for somebody who was an obstetrician and who might be interested in that thing. And so it was in, as I say, I think it was September of '69. I joined the college, and I had 2 or 3 visits. I mean, they looked around over and under my qualifications, I guess. And it seems to me as I was back there on 3 occasions, and finally moved back in November of '69.
You know, prior to that time, the college had had 2 physician directors, one at a time. You of course, would represent the first time that there'd been 2 physicians.
That's correct.
At the college.
Duke Cambro was actually Richardson. Don Richardson was the director, and then came Duke Kimbrough for a period of time, and Duke died. And then Michael Newton came on board, and this was the first time that they had a so-called additional medical director.
So you arrived in '69, and you retired from the college when?
5 years ago, 1985.
So it was a span of 16 years.
16, yes, yes.
When you first came to the college, you know, tell me some of the names of the people you were working with, because I think times to come our listeners are going to be interested in that.
Oh, I have to. When you get old, Warren, you have trouble with names. I mean, you.
Well, how about the people you worked with who, right around that time, who were still with the college?
Oh, well, there was, of course, Judy Molyneux is the first name that comes up, because Judy, I think, I had some experience with her prior to becoming involved with the college, and I was on 1 or 2 of the committees earlier. And Bill McDaniel, of course, Don Richardson, Michael Newton, those were the... I'm at a loss to grab some of the names of the other stalwarts who were the secretaries and so on, but the ones I remember so well are the ones that were eventually in my shop.
What were the responsibilities you undertook then in 1969, and how did they grow over the years?
Well, that's kind of interesting, and I've tried to reflect back as to what I was doing and what I did. Actually, the activities of the college throughout my experience with them has been really twofold. It's been, the one is in education, continuing education, and the other one is in the various practice aspects of obstetrics and gynecology. And I had the good fortune, or the, I'm not sure it's good fortune, but I was the lucky one who was sort of the administrative individual of both of those activities, the educational activities on one side and the practice activities on the other, and the committees that were related to those 2 groups.
And then, of course, as the college grew, I think, and more people came, your responsibilities went more into the practice area.
Well, we went along for about a year after I joined, and as I remember, we sort of looked over both of those things, and then Dick Stander came on board sometime in
it was about 75 or 76.
Was it? You know, I was trying to think back, but Dick came on, and he took on the responsibility of education, and so that sort of split off that particular aspect. And of course, in the meantime, as he took on the responsibility of education, the practice thing grew and grew, and our problems, I don't think they multiplied, but we became aware of them, such things as professional liability and such things as our relationship to the federal government and our relationship to the other organizations as practitioners. So as we peeled them off on one side, we added them on the other.
There came a time then when it looked to the college, it looked as if we should have an office in Washington. What happened then?
Well, early in the game, I was doing a fair amount of traveling, and one of the travel points was, of course, Washington, D.C. A hearing would come up, or we had certain positions that we'd like to present to the government to have them react, or to some of the administrative people, public health people, and so on. And it eventually occurred to us that the right thing to do would be to open a small office down there so that we would have a identifiable telephone, an identifiable office, identifiable people that those folks could relate to. And we started out then with a very small, I thought it was pretty good size, man. I think we had 5 people eventually in this first office, and we were just about 4 blocks from the Capitol, and we had those 4 people very, very busy.
And what happened next?
Well, the first thing we did, we thought, well, I'll stay in Chicago and sort of commute back and forth, and one of the people who had been working with us in Chicago, and who incidentally is still with the college, and that's Mrs. Locke, was assigned to move down to Washington and to sort of be the person that people would relate to down there. And then I was going to commute back and forth. Well, after a period of time, it became apparent that our assignments were a little bit confusing, and Elaine came back to Chicago, and I moved down full-time. And that then led into the next phase, in which as we got busier and busier, it became apparent that we needed more close dialogue with the head office. And I think there was a fellow that came along by the name of Dr. Pearse, who thought that it might be worthwhile to investigate the idea of moving the whole shop down there rather than having all of this commuting back and forth. I recall so well that we began to have a little task force of our own looking for places where we might bring the whole shop, and we looked over a number of areas, and one I remember distinctly was a very historical building there by the Lincoln Memorial, and we thought that would be a real stabilizing, I mean a substantive representation of the college. And the executive director had a little bit bigger vision than I had, and he said, okay, that'll take care of 60 people. What are we going to do when we have 150?
And everybody said, we'll never have 150.
That's right. But as an upshot of that, there was a new building going up right across from the Space Museum.
Right.
And we were able to negotiate with them, and we established a relationship where we were able to move into an office that had those expansive capabilities. However, even then our eyes weren't as big as our consumption, and after a few years it seemed that we needed even something bigger.
It went from, I think, about 1977, when you first went to Washington, till 1981, when we all moved. Yeah. Nick, what things are you most proud of in the time you spent with the college?
Oh, I think, number one, the fellows out there had several things that were really very distressing to them. And I think the first thing that we did is that we got into the government relations bit and established a real dialogue with the federal government and with our legislative body, so that we were able to present to them some of the needs that we as practitioners needed in order to deliver to patients the kind of care that we would like to see. Along with this thing, of course, came our continuing problem of professional liability, and I was able to think out and to persuade, I guess, even yourself that the establishment of a division of professional liability to make this one of the key points of what we were doing down there would be worthwhile. And that was effected, and I think that those two divisions are the things that I look back and say I'm very pleased with. Now, we did a lot of other things. I mean, we came out, and I'm thinking back, all of a sudden I think, well, there's standards of care that we got involved with, and I think that they were some monumental things that came out of that, and the Pearses that came out and those things. But to look back and say, I think it's the government relations and the professional liability.
Well, your contributions over those 16 years were really many. Indeed, you were, I think Nick was regarded as kind of the father figure of the college.
I don't know.
You don't have to respond to that.
Well, I'd like to say this, though. I've been very fortunate in life. I've had fun in the many things that I have done. I enjoyed practice to an nth degree, but the crown, I think, of my career was the 17 years plus minus that I was with the college and the things that we've done, and particularly the interrelationships that have come not only with the staff that we were so fortunate to have working with us, but to the obstetricians and the fellows around the country, to the people in the Indian Health Service, to the people in the federal government. And it was a very, very exciting and rewarding time.
Our guest today, Dr. Ervin Nichols. Nick, hundreds, perhaps thousands of fellows regard you fondly. Bless you for being my visitor this afternoon.
Thank you very much for having me.